Hey, PU sister students, this is Baker's Backyard again. Hope you're doing well. This is lesson 2 of 4 that we're going to do on Unit 2, which is on British North American settlement between 1607 and 1754. And you'll notice that today we have a lot of document emphasis with what we will be discussing if you are actually in our regular class. So 2 of the first objectives here are basically the lesson, and the last 3 will be what you'll want to focus on as you read your documents, as you study them more, and as you discuss them possibly amongst your peers. So we want to be able to explain the causes and effects of the transatlantic trade over time. Okay, so this doesn't just happen, right? When we're talking about this idea of this Atlantic exchange, right, that we've been kind of talking a little bit about with exchange of goods, with the Colonial exchange, we're going to take it to another level today as we look at the triangular trade and some of the things that define especially British settlement and how it affected the economy, because it has a big effect on colonial thinking in the long term. Okay, ergo Unit 3. Explain the causes and effects of slavery in the various British colonial regions. Yes, one thing, guys, to keep in mind is that slavery is going to be present outside of just southern colonies and eventually southern states. Okay, so therefore it is in some of the other states. And so the origins of that we'll look at briefly. And then we want to be able to look at things using document ideas, whether it's content analysis and also, of course, our understanding of outside information. We want to compare. The big theme of Unit 2 is comparison. How can we compare colonial regions? How can we compare the way that religion affected different regions, et cetera, et cetera? Okay, we want to explain how and why the different goals and interests of European leaders and colonists affected how they viewed themselves and their relationship with Britain, right? And this could be political, social, economic. Okay, there's a lot of things, even in our last lesson, that we can do that with. And then last, we want to explain how and why the movement of a variety of people and ideas across the Atlantic contributed to the development of the American culture over time. This essentially, guys, brings us to 3 major themes, and that is going to be work exchange and technology. It's also going to deal with social development to an extent and America's place in the world. So I tell you what, let's get started. So when we think, guys, you might want to stop your pause here or whatever and ask yourself the question, okay, what am I looking at? Well, duh, it's a map. That's self-explanatory. But at the end of the day, what is happening? Exchange, trade, movement of goods, and also people when you're looking at the slave trade side of it. Okay? And so very important to keep in mind is how all these different developments of these cities and ports and different relations that they have with goods. And you can see like manufactured goods are going from place to place, and raw materials are also going from place to place and things like that. And this is going to very much affect a system that we'll look at briefly in a moment with the way that the colonies are supposed to relate to the British Empire and vice versa. Okay, so this is moving us further into the 16 and of course the earlier 1700s. So what are we getting at? We're getting at a couple of things to keep in mind. Well, keep in mind, having an empire is costly. It's costly to defend it. It's costly to basically be able to help sustain it in different ways. Okay, and you can see a little bit with Spanish, guys. So think back to the context of what leads us into Unit 2. The Spanish restricted trade and instituted royal monopolies to protect their profits. This was unsustainable over time. What does that mean, unsustainable? It's not going to be something that can happen over the long term. Okay, and so therefore, other European countries that really started to colonize after the Spanish in larger amounts, the British and the French, as you can see, or English, excuse me, they're going to be like, that system doesn't work. Therefore, they're going to say, okay, we're going to do something different. Now, when you think of mercantilism, you probably think of things like having a favorable balance of trade, right? So you want to have more exports than imports, right? That's what we mean, guys, when we say favorable balance of trade. So the exports are here, they're weighing more, and then also the idea of gold and silver, right? This idea of, materials and things like that. So you want your colonies to be able to work for you. But in order for that to happen, you have to have guidelines, or at least that's what one of the arguments is. And that's where we have what became known as the Navigation Acts. Okay, so when we think of navigation, what probably comes to mind? We think of ships moving from place to place. We think probably about the previous map where they're going across to different areas of the world and so forth. Okay, so if you're trying to practice the system of mercantilism and profit is the name of the game, which, let's face the facts, that's a big part of capitalism, right? Or at least one of the elements of it. So what do you want to be able to do? You want to be able to have a degree of control over your colonial possessions, what they're producing, how they're producing it perhaps, and the way that they're making the goods available to the rest of the world. And so the Britain put a series of policies together. The one that probably stands out the most is the one that you see right here, that colonial goods were expected or required to pass through English ports. Okay, so there's going to be a lot of things that Americans are producing: textiles, hats, iron goods. It's not mentioned here, but the idea of shipbuilding in New England becomes huge. Okay, and so what do we notice? Well, what happens, and we'll see this more, guys, in the next unit, when a country does not exert itself with its rules? Well, it's the same principle if a parent doesn't. Okay, you let somebody get away with something, and then they're going to basically do things like pirateering, perhaps, or they're going to basically do smuggling, and it's not going to be upheld well. The British do not basically keep a firm rein on the expectation of the system, which a lot of you guys have maybe heard the term salutary neglect. That is going to be something that the colonists get used to. Okay, but that's a story for obviously the next unit, but it's something to keep in the back of your mind. Okay, and so what does this mean? It means that ports are obviously becoming more important. Charleston, Wilmington, North Carolina to an extent, Boston, all right? Harbors like that can actually allow, New York, of course, is another one, the list goes on, that really have a lot to do with this system. Okay, and so we see the rise of this merchant culture that's going to affect trade. Okay, and so these urban centers start to actually pop up quite a bit. And guys, you'll notice here, you have this consumer revolution, okay, where people want all these different products and all these different cash crops, whether it's England wanting our tobacco or whatever it might be, or us wanting some goods that are coming from the other parts of the world, or, eventually, as we'll see in our next thing here, guys, the way that slavery is going to, of course, affect the colonies and eventually the United States. It's a very important thing to keep in mind. So this culture of, people that are used to having extravagant goods, this development of this class of different people, which we'll look more at in our next session, is going to be really, really important. When you have access to things that you like and that you hold to be really essential to good living, like, for example, the two, right? Things like that. You're going to see the development of a culture of people that are in different areas of social status and structure. Okay. And so a colonial aristocracy is going to be developing, and this aristocracy is going to be very evident, especially in places in a lot of parts of the South, right? You see a lot of attention, guys, brought to that, so with politics and socioeconomic status, of course, and even, the economy, which all three of those things connect in a lot of ways, okay? And so again, this idea of Boston, right, becoming pretty important is pretty significant, okay? And so what happens? We'll take a look. It's going to have a very big effect on the idea of the nature of labor, All right. So free laborers moved from town to town looking for work. Okay. So migration, movement, trying to find what's the next best place to be able to find the best work possible to bring a lot of the opportunity to be able to buy these goods and things like that. Okay. And yes, you do have poverty as well. Okay. And so what do we notice? Pause for a second and ask yourself this question. What stands out about the way that our economy and the colonies in different regions is developing, similarities and differences? Okay. So a quick thing is you notice a lot of farming, right? Cattle and grain. This is going to be, a lot of, again, the middle colonies from New York as far south as basically Pennsylvania, including Delaware and also New Jersey, right? You're going to see obviously a good amount of farming there, a lot of tobacco, like we said, in parts of, some parts of Delaware, but also Maryland, also Virginia, and also North Carolina, which we'll talk more about the social structure with that in North Carolina in the next session. And then as you can see in South Carolina, which is going to be the area that has a lot of aristocratic influence, especially the Carolina colonies, as you can see, a lot of rice and indigo. So you're talking about cash crops that you're going to be able to sell abroad. In all these areas, Charleston, Savannah, okay, and even as you can see here, furs, skins, trading, shipping, all these different things. Now, as you could imagine, does geography and environment affect this? Of course it does. Whether it's these areas are close to the coast, and therefore they're going to rely on fishing because let's say it's a northern city that its climate is not as conducive to obviously large-scale agriculture, then yeah, they're going to be focusing, as you can see, on these different things. Okay, so the colonies are kind of going to develop, guys, this identity in a sense that we are helping the empire, and you know what? They need us. All right, and the British are going to be thinking, well, you know what? We're a market for your goods, therefore you need us, et cetera, et cetera. You can probably see the handwriting on the wall for how this is going to create a pretty significant divide between colonies and their relationship with the British crown or the British government or whatever you want to call it, or empire, and vice versa. Okay. So moving forward. So when we think of the institution of slavery, we think of, again, a lot of different things that have long-term consequences. Okay, so not a lot of notes on this, guys, but a very important thing for us to keep in mind. So we talked about last session, 1619, we see the first slaves brought to Jamestown. Huge for the long-term consequence of slavery in North America, in British North America, I should say. But as we'll see in the next couple of slides, it is not just unique to the concept of Southern agriculture. Very important that we keep that in mind. Okay, so the Royal African Company, again, specific evidence, guys, was chartered by the British Parliament. What does that mean? It means that they're basically given the rightful authority through the legislature to do this. Okay, and as you can see, 108 years, 1808, if you're kind of wondering, well, why is 1808 the stopping point? The reason being is the Constitution. Okay, Constitution, as you all will learn next unit, is going to make it very clear. It's a compromise, by the way. A lot of people didn't like it, but it was like, we need this Constitution, we'll compromise. But it said that the slave trade could not be ended before 1807. Ergo, the year after is when they cut off the external slave trade. That does not end the slave trade that you hear about within the country, with families being broken up, children being taken away from parents, etc. But as you can see, 3 million enslaved Africans over the course of that century plus. Okay, and a lot of you have, of course, heard of the famous, Middle Passage, which we'll look at in a second. But guys, I mean, if you look here, you'll notice exactly what we're talking about with a lot of these numbers. Okay, And this right here shows you the slave trade. I think it's both, within and also outside. But then you'll notice here, again, a sizable amount of it. You can see Caribbean, all right? So Barbados, think about places like that you're going to see a lot of that going. I think another thing to keep in mind, Brazil, which remember was actually a Portuguese settlement or colony. That's a sizable amount of slavery going there too, which a lot of times you don't hear about quite as much as you would with, of course, the British North American colonies. Okay, so just keep that in mind. That's pretty important to at least, be able to think about comparison and contrast with how slavery develops. Okay, I know that this is not the easiest thing to read, but the main thing here, guys, is not for you to memorize numbers, but it's for you to see how, in fact, we see a very large spread of slavery in British North America. New Hampshire, these are all, of course, important settlements. Massachusetts, as you can see, a sizable population of slaves. As you can see, Virginia, that's a lot of slave labor. South Carolina. Now, the percentage over here is what percentage of that population of slaves made up the total population of the colony. That's a lot. Therefore, what do we notice? You're going to see a very big dependency on agriculture in many of these states, guys, that are having your larger numbers. Okay, so the point is, those states in the South, while they're not unique with slavery, that development of plantation agriculture in a lot of those areas, what you notice is that they're not going to be as likely to diversify their economy the same way that you will with northern cities and states and even middle colonies. It's a very important thing to keep in the back of your minds. Okay, so what do we notice? To fill demand for enslaved persons, African traders moved further inland. Okay, so not just along, the coast any longer, but they're moving a little bit further inland. And this is where, of course, you hear probably the most attention that's actually brought to this famous Middle Passage. Okay, and as you can see here, a lot of them are, in fact, going to be going to parts of the Caribbean. Barbados, we already talked about these slave codes that develop that are going to be basically laws that have restrictions and guidelines. And that's not going to be just unique to Barbados. In fact, a lot of your slave codes that you see that are actually passed in colonies and future states, colonies like South Carolina, etc., what are they basically doing? They're following suit with a lot of the policies of Barbados to put some restrictions on rights of slaves, right? And of course, their liberties. Okay. And this is probably the most common picture of course, a ship from that Middle Passage, where I think it was as many as, I think the average was like 20% at least of a typical Middle Passage voyage, okay, is actually going to be, those people that were on that ship, 20% of them, 1/5, if you like fractions, are not going to be surviving that trip. Men, women, etc. Okay, so that's a pretty big deal. And of course, the cramped quarters and disease and things like that. Okay, so what's going to happen? Cash crop societies became overly reliant on this. That leads to slave societies. They had their own cultures in a lot of ways. Gula, I don't think it's mentioned on the slide, but the Gula language is going to be very reflective of these communities where they can actually speak. In fact, it was kind of interesting, guys, when you look at how some of them opposed some of the conditions. Part of that was trying to have a culture of their own. Eventually having, after the days of slavery and abolition, when abolition happens, you'll notice a lot more commitment even to not just having faith communities, which were there before, but having their own faith communities and forming their own churches. Okay. Plantation owning Southern elites. In other words, aristocrats, okay, are going to become really essential. Okay. Now, it just so happens that about 2/3 of people in South Carolina which we just looked at the slave population compared to the rest of them, 2/3 of the population of South Carolina did not own slaves that were Caucasian Caucasian settlers. Okay. So it's not like everybody in the South or any state that had slavery that everybody was owning them, but it is going to have a big effect, especially on your culture of plantation development, etc. All right. And that's not just unique to British North America, guys. Keep in mind, we talked about that a little bit, actually, quite a bit, redundant there, in our last session. Okay. So, and what's going to be the negative effect for Native Americans, as we'll look at more on our next session, westward movement. Okay. The idea that we need more land. And part of this is going to be a result, guys, of this. Part of it's going to be a result of social class differences with other, small farmers that really don't own land. We'll look at a little bit of some of the examples, guys, of rebellions, and also some of the Native American conflicts that happen in our next session. Very important to be making connections on that. Okay. So therefore, like we said a moment ago, these slave codes legalizing human bondage. Barbados, excuse me, is going to start a lot of these, and they're going to infiltrate into parts of South Carolina, Virginia, and other parts of states colonies, and later on states that did allow for this to happen. It is going to have a dramatic effect on Southern society. We'll talk about social effects next time. Very important. Okay, so rice cultivation began as a dietary supplement for enslaved people, but later became a very profitable crop for plantation owners. So they're going to see, okay, we're going to feed it to our slaves, etc. But you know what? It's going to bring in money too. Okay, again, that idea is big. Okay, and then as you can see, these plantations are going to grow in scope and size. So as a result, you notice that. Okay. And so we'll look at these rebellions a little bit more. Probably the most well-known rebellion to keep in your mind will be the Stono Rebellion, which really goes back to with the resistance and things like that. A lot of these people, if we were basically to move somewhere else, we would want to keep a degree of our own culture, most likely. And that's exactly what we're talking about. Customs, belief systems. That could be religion, language, like the Gullah, G-U-L-L-A-H. Okay, breaking tools. Okay, rebelling, as we'll look at more in our next session, guys, with different kinds of rebellions, whether they're slave or class warfare, things like that. Okay, so it's very important for us to keep in mind how this is going to impact the development of the country, the colonies into the next phase of American history, and of course, as we know, beyond. All right, so that is basically our lesson, guys, on understanding the transatlantic trade, the influence of mercantilism, the influence of, how Britain is going to try to manage the colonies, and then also the unfortunate introduction of the institution of slavery through, of course, the Middle Passage and of course, even part of the triangular trade. We're going to stop there if you're in my class. If not, what I would like for you to do is to take a look at your documents. You read several documents that were anywhere from the Mayflower Compact to, William Penn and different things like that. And so I have a couple of food for thought questions that you might want to think about as you basically go through them again, think about them, try to apply them to some of the things that we've talked about today. In other words, application to our lecture or discussion. And that is, how did the Mayflower Compact pave the way for a heritage of democracy in the Plymouth colony? The big debate that comes up with this, or at least one of them, is, were the colonies truly democratic? I'm going to hold off on that for the moment. But what a lot of historians, guys, would agree with is this, that while the colonies were not completely democratic, there were elements of democratic, support and all that. All right. We'll look at the town meeting with the Puritans a little bit more next time. But the one thing that I think most historians do agree on that I've read is that while it's not fully democratic, it is more democratic than you would find in parts of Europe. So what we want to think about, guys, is first of all, what do we mean when we say democratic? And second of all, what do we mean by that statement, more democratic than what you would find in Europe? Secondly, we want to be thinking of thematic things. We've been talking about like, the effects of social things, geography, social development, political, economic. You want to think about, how do the documents illustrate these kinds of themes and how that relates to the overall development of British North America. Okay, so a couple of friendly reminders for those of you that actually are looking to Friday for basically the end of your week. First of all, you should have a second attempt taken on your weekly mastery quiz. Why? One, you're working on timing. You're also working on the idea of accuracy. Okay, so remember, you have potential to see different questions each time that you take the quiz. So it kind of gives you a little bit of an idea. What is a historian argument going to look like on something related to the reading for this week? What about primary sources, right, that are more excerpt based? And then those that are more visual, charts, graphs, maps, okay? We're going to start to basically write a short answer question. That'll be your assignment for Friday, okay? My suggestion to you is to try to attend the office hours from 11 to noon. We will basically do a sample. We will walk through the grading process. If you are not able to attend, I understand. The question will actually be in this, the video that I posted on the skill of writing an SAQ, as will the actual rubric that we will going through. All of those things can be found under the supplemental content of week 2 in Canvas. Okay, you will have 15 minutes to handwrite your DBQ. When you submit it to Canvas, you will be taking a screenshot from your iPad, and you will actually be submitting that screenshot to the Canvas portal. Please follow the directions carefully with how to do that. And if you have any problems, then communicate to me and send it to me via email. But I would prefer Canvas as your first option. Okay. Everything for week 3 will be available minus the pre-recorded videos by Friday morning at 8 a.m. You will have the objectives again. You will have the reading, chapter 3. You'll have the document assignment that will basically be based off of a few additional sources for this. And guys, guess what we get to start doing week 3? More SAQ practice and long essay. Okay, so stay tuned for that. As always, feel free to contact me at bakerd@franklinacademy.org. I hope that you've had a great session this week with how to look at transatlantic trade. The slave trade, of course, is an interesting detail to give us some perspective on what's coming with future events and as we progress, and also the settlement of these colonies. Thank you. Hope you'll have a great one, and feel free to reach out if you have any questions. Thank you.